Hello and welcome to my channel, She's Just Trying. I'm Hearts, and today we're going to be reading a story by Iskander Khan. So he is a well-known story writer on Reddit, and I'm going to be reading his story, The Farm. So sit back, relax, and listen to The Farm. I was never the romantic type, but I don't think you could blame me. Mom and Dad fought like cats and dogs, going through a messy divorce when my sister and I were still young. I didn't believe in true love. I didn't think there was the one. But that all changed when I met Sophie Norris. I was a city kid. I spent all my time hanging around Boston Common with my buddies before we stuffed our faces with meatball subs of the North End. She was a country girl. She spent all her time on the family farm out in Iowa, playing in the cornfields and eating lovingly home-cooked meals. She was a college student and didn't mind that I was a few years older. Nor did she care about my dead-end job unloading ships at the harbor. We just clicked. She was everything I wasn't. She was smart, patient, well-read. She took an interest in the arts. She was beautiful, and the more we dated, the more I found myself catching feelings. By the time summer came round, I couldn't bear to go like 3 months without seeing her. So we arranged for me to drive out to Iowa to visit her and her family on their farm. I was ecstatic. Despite her progressive attitudes, she was in many respects a deeply traditional girl. So I knew the key to her heart was winning over her parents, and I was more than prepared to do that. So when the day came, I packed my stuff, loaded up my car, and set off for Iowa. It goes without saying that it was a long drive. 19 hours in total, with an overnight stop in a Detroit motel. It was tedious in the extreme, but the prospect of being reunited with her spurred me on. She had given me an address and rough directions, but getting lost among the miles upon miles of cornfields was way too easy. I couldn't call her to ask her to guide me in. She had warned me that the cell service in her area was spotty. So I drove up and down a stretch of road just south of Essenberg until I finally found someone to ask directions from. They'd never heard of the Norris family farm, but told me they knew of an old dirt road near the place called Rush Lake. I thanked them, but they warned me it wasn't the kind of place that strangers were welcome. I wasn't about to let that deter me though, so I set off in search of it, and eventually found the place they were referring to. I immediately understood what they meant. An old, hand-painted wooden sign told trespassers that they would be shot. Yet I drove down the dirt road anyway, telling myself that the reward far outweighed the risks. After about half a mile of trundling down the old dirt road, I passed through an open wooden gate that led to a big old farmhouse, a cattle shed, and a huge red barn. Frankly, it was amazing that any strangers found themselves wandering onto that place at all. It was tucked away among the corn, a little slice of cloistered heaven, far away from prying eyes. At first, I wasn't sure I had the right place, not until I saw Sophie walk out onto the porch of the farmhouse, an expression of delight on her face. She ran up to the car as I climbed out of the driver's seat, beyond excited to hug her for the first time in weeks. "Alex, you made it! You actually came!" she chirped. Her voice quivered as she fought back tears and fell into my arms. Of course I did. I missed you too much. We broke our embrace just in time for me to see her family congregating on the porch, and they were exactly what I expected from her descriptions of them. Her barrel-chested father, arms folded in his denim dungarees, looked on with vague suspicion, while her mother smiled warmly at the heart-warming reunion. But I hadn't quite expected her brother to be so huge. He was her junior by a number of years, and for some reason, the image of him as a young boy had cemented in my mind. To see him now, with his frankly colossal stature, was rather intimidating. "Come meet the family," she said, taking me by the hand and eagerly leading me towards the house. It was early on the Friday evening when I finally arrived, just in time for dinner. And as Sophie's mom laid out a spread of roasted meats and vegetables, I made my introductions.
Good to finally have you here,
Mr. Norris said in a deep, gravelly voice.
We've heard an awful lot about you.
All good, I hope, I replied nervously.
Glowing, but I told her, if something seems too good to be true.
Amos, don't be so rude. This young man's traveled a long way to be here, Miss Norris exclaimed before turning to me. I'm so sorry about my husband. He's a man of many skills, but his socials are sorely lacking. I get it, ma'am. He's just protective of his daughter, I said.
You see, Mona? The boy gets it,
he said before turning back to me.
Sophie said you were a smart one. But how is it that someone so smart didn't end up going to college?
Victim of circumstance, I suppose. Family finances weren't great. I remained polite, but the question hit a nerve. I guess I wanted to learn the value of hard work before I tried higher education. Something that you obviously know all too well. You must have worked your butt off to be able to afford college fees. It was a compliment engineered to make Mr. Norris smile with pride, but nothing registered on his face. Sophie didn't have any loans, and wanted for nothing. I had a huge amount of respect for her father, long before I'd ever met him. So, Mr. Norris, do you sell your produce directly to supermarkets? Or are they like distributors or something? I asked. Sophie's mom and dad shot each other a look, before her dad cleared his throat apprehensively.
We're not selling a farm, son, he began. We're a pearly substance here. Let's just say I've been lucky with a few investments I made over the years. But enough small talk. Finish your food and I'll show you around. You got a lot of work to help me with tomorrow.
I really did try to finish what was on my plate. I was half starved from the day's long drive. But there was something about the way the meat tasted. Something slightly bitter and nauseating about it. I've never been a fan of liver, and I suppose that was what it was. Being a substance farm, there was a good chance that they ate every single part of the animals they slaughtered. But God help me if I offended them in the first hours of meeting them. So I ate as much as I could stomach, then ate out like I was full. There was only one reason I found myself just slightly hesitant to visit Sophie on our family farm. That was the fact that, as she explicitly told me, her father would expect anyone willing to date or marry his daughter of being capable of working on the farm. In her words, a good farmhand showed diligence and fortitude, things that she too hoped to find in a potential partner, let alone what her father would expect of them. I considered myself a hard worker, and working down at the harbor could be physically grueling on occasion, but I knew it would pale in comparison to the kind of thing Mr. Norris would have me doing. The wake-up call came at 4:30 a.m. I thought I was hardcore for getting up at 6:30 for work days, but here was Sophie's dad, fresh as a goddamn daisy while the sun had barely even grazed the sky.
Get up, boy, we got work to do. Meet me at the cattle shed in 15 minutes. We'll see what you're made of.
It was extremely early, but that wasn't why I was so tired. I had hardly slept a wink, having felt terrible all night. I'd never really eaten liver before, and I guess it just didn't agree with me. So there I was, exhausted, stumbling towards a cowshed in the middle of rural Iowa at a truly ungodly hour. I lit myself a cigarette as soon as I walked outside. If I didn't have time for coffee, I sure as hell was getting a smoke in before work commenced. But as soon as Sophie's dad lays eyes on the lit bud between my fingers, he scowled.
Sophie didn't mention you were a smoker.
Yeah, I'm trying to quit. She keeps pushing me to give up. You obviously brought her up to be...
Life is precious,
Mr. Norris interrupted.
A man should do everything in his power to give himself longevity. Give that thing to me.
I took one last drag on it before handing it over, watching as he walked away over to a nearby trash can, stamped it out, and threw it away.
Don't smoke that stuff on my farm again, boy.
He struck me as the kind of man who could be very warm when he wanted to be. But in that moment, the look in his eyes struck the fear of God into me.
Ever milked a cow before?
He said after a long uncomfortable silence. No, sir.
Well, you're gonna learn today.
As he led me into the cattle shed, the first thing that struck me was the smell. Thanks to an 8th grade field trip, I'd been around the farm animal before, but I'd never smelled anything so awful in my entire life. A stench of rot and sour milk. Mr. Norris set up a stool near one of the cows, then proceeded to roll up his shirt sleeves. He told me to watch carefully, and for a few moments, I did, but my eyes were quickly drawn elsewhere. I had never seen a cow as sickly as that ever. She was skeletal. Her eyes were a milky white around the pupils. I watched in disgust as a fat, black housefly landed right on the soft, moist lining of her eye. She didn't seem to react at all.
Hey, I told you to pay attention,
Mr. Norris suddenly growled. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. I turned my attention back to the milk pail that sat beneath the cow's wrinkled udders, mapped by a web of black veins. What was in the milk pail looked wrong. It looked sour, like it had the consistency of yogurt. But I watched as Sophie's dad took a small metal ladle, scooped up a thick, gooey liquid, and brought it to his lips with a wet slurp.
Ain't nothing like it. Strengthens the bones. Here, try some,
he said, offering me the ladle. I'm good, thanks. Maybe a little too early for me.
Suit yourself,
he said, taking another slurp before letting the ladle's contents slide back down into the pail with a sickening slosh.
Now go wash up yourself and get some breakfast. I need you in the beet field.
Back at the farmhouse, I found Sophie and her mom preparing breakfast as I sat down at the kitchen table with her older brother. How you doing, big guy? You sleep well? I said to him. He gave me a cold stare, not saying a word in reply. Don't mind him, Sophie's mom chimed in. He's a quiet one. Always has been. Strong and silent type, I said. I like it. I turned back to him, but there was nothing behind his eyes. I raised a hand to give him a gentle wave, but he didn't move, just stayed stone still as he waited for breakfast. Sophie put down a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me, but I found them just as unpalatable as last night's meal. I tried to fill up with the toast that was stacked up on the table, but even that stuff I had to force down. Yet, what I found deeply disconcerting was that Sophie and her brother seemed to relish their meals, like they couldn't taste anything amiss with them at all. And it's not like Sophie didn't know good food. We'd have spent a lot of time in some of the finest restaurants in all of New England, probably the entire country. She was quite the connoisseur. I was barely finished eating before Sophie's dad poked his head into the kitchen.
Enough rest. Beet fields, 5 minutes.
I cleared my plate, apologizing to Sophie's mom that my appetite must have been off, then trudged out of the beet field to meet her dad.
This one should be easy, even for a city boy like you,
he said, kneeling among rows of neatly planted greenery.
You gotta get a good, firm grip of the leaves here, right at the stem, then twist and pull them out of the ground, see?
He demonstrated his technique, and then left me to get on with the work. Basket in hand, I knelt down into the dirt, pulling up beets just like he'd shown me. I was exhausted, barely paying attention to what I was doing, until pulling one particular beet left a stain on my hand. I had to double check to make sure I hadn't accidentally cut myself on something. The texture and the color wasn't like anything I'd ever seen from a beetroot, even down to how sticky it felt when I rubbed the juice between my fingers.
What are you staring at, boy?
Mr. Norris scared the hell out of me, having crept out from God knows where. Are these things meant to leak like this?
Sometimes, when they're fresh, sure.
But the color?
Best goddamn beets in the entire country. Not like the stuff that you find in the goddamn super duper markets.
I mean, I suppose...
Enough talk,
he said, picking up the full basket of beets before placing another empty one down in front of me.
You're gonna pick another basketful, then you're gonna come help me with the corn.
He turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath as he did so. I picked my way along another row of beets, trying to keep my mind off how peculiar they seemed. But as he was so quick to remind me, I was just a city kid, out here where I didn't belong, working on something I was totally unfamiliar with. So who was I to question the quality of their produce? I just kept my mind on Sophie and carried on with the task at hand. At around noon, I met Mr. Norris in the cornfield.
You did alright with those beets. Now let's see you with the corn.
Again, he demonstrated the proper technique of tearing off the ears, tossing them in the basket before leaving me to do it. It was considerably easier than pulling beets, the repetitive motions of which had left a dull ache in my shoulder. But just like the beets, I noticed something rather strange about this produce too. The husk that coated the corn felt like old dry skin, the kind that forms on a cut or graze after it's scabbed over. But that wasn't what freaked me out. What had the hairs rising on my back of my neck was that I noticed something dark and black on one of the corn husks, in a very familiar shape. It appeared to be a faded black ink in the shape of a heart, one that looked just like an old tattoo. Just then, I heard a rustling in the cornfield behind me. "Mr. Norris, is that you?" I called out, but there was no reply. I turned, staring into the vast green ocean of tall green stalks before me. I took a few steps forward, trying to get a glimpse of whatever just made the noise, and felt my heart thump when I heard the same rustling, this time accompanied by swaying among the top of nearby corn stalks. Someone, or something, was definitely in there, just feet away from me, just out of sight. I moved along the rows with dreadful anticipation, when suddenly I saw them. A pair of black eyes staring back at me from the shadows. As soon as that thing's gaze met mine, it darted off through the cornfield in the opposite direction, grunting as it went. I had no idea what I just locked eyes with, but it was short and covered in thick, dark hair. For a few moments after that distinct rustling died down, a dreadful silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of a gruff voice coming from behind me.
"You call for me, boy?"
It was Mr. Norris, having almost frightened the life out of me for the second time that day. "Jesus, I think I saw something in the field there."
"Saw what?"
"I don't know exactly. I think it was a pig."
"We don't keep pigs on the farm, boy. Only cows."
"Well, it certainly looked like a pig. Only it was all covered in hair, this thick black..."
"Will have been a wild hog. They break through the fences sometimes, eat up all our produce. It's not entirely a bad thing. I'll get the shotgun and head back out this field in the tonight. Might have some fresh meat on the table tomorrow."
"Yeah, must be a real problem trying to keep interlopers at bay. We have the same problem down at the harbor, only it's not like we can use a shotgun to fit the situation." I laughed. He didn't. It was then that another thought came to mind, one that had a question attached. "So, is all your stuff organic here, Mr. Norris?"
"Organic?"
He threw the word back at me like it was another language. "Yeah, like not using any nasty pesticides or anything like that." It had certainly explained why some of his produce was so different.
"We don't have that problem here on the farm, boy."
And that's when it hit me. It was high summer. There should have been flies, bees, aspids, insects of all varieties buzzing around the field. It dawned on me that I hadn't seen or heard a single one at that point any time that day. I was just about to ask him another question when Mr. Norris cut me off.
"Now come on, we're just about done here. Let's head back to the house."
but I've barely feel the...
I won't tell you again, boy. Now, come on.
I spent the remainder of the afternoon with Sophie, hanging out down by a stream which ran through the property. Sitting in the grass and talking with her made me forget just how strange the whole day's event had seemed. And besides, getting up at 4:30 in the morning has a way of dulling your sense of perception. When I was with her, I didn't have a care in the world, and no amount of weird vegetables or cranky old farmers could change that. I don't think your dad likes me very much. That's just his way. He'll warm up to you in time. You just gotta prove yourself. Prove myself how? You just gotta show that you can be part of this family. And I'll be honest, this ain't gonna be easy. But you'll manage it. If you love me, you'll find a way to manage it. That was all I needed to hear. I did love her, more than I thought was ever possible. And in that moment, I was still prepared to do whatever it took to win her parents' approval. That evening, after another dinner in which I forced down more of Miss Norris's terrible cooking, I decided to get an early night so I'd be ready for more hard labor in the morning. Obviously, Sophie and I weren't sleeping in the same bed, so I wished her a good night and climbed the stairs to the guest room, where I fell asleep pretty much as soon as my head hit the pillow. However, just a few hours later, I found myself awakened by a rumbling in my stomach. For the second night running, Miss Norris's home cooking had not agreed with me. Only this time, I had to sneak off to the bathroom to empty my stomach as quietly as possible for fear of waking up the rest of the family. But not all of them were sleeping, as I heard voices coming from downstairs as I crept back across the landing. It was Mr. and Mrs. Norris, having some kind of hushed disagreement in the kitchen. "You can't go out there, Amos. You just can't," Miss Norris was pleading.
You know I have to. One of them got out today. Sophie's boy almost ran into it in the cornfield,
implored her husband. "Can't you just leave them be? If it catches you out there before you see it, it'll..."
"Then I won't let it,"
Mr. Norris interjected.
"I've dealt with those things before. I can do it again."
"Oh God, Amos, but what if..."
"Listen to me, woman. If that thing escapes this farm, and the world outside finds out what we're doing here, it'll be the end of us. You know that."
I know, just please, I'm begging you. Be careful out there."
"I will."
I listened as Mr. Norris walked down the hall downstairs, hearing the distinct sound of him loading some kind of firearm as he walked. And as he walked out of the house into the night, I crept back into bed and lay there, knowing exactly what he was out there trying to hunt, but wondering just what the hell it really was. The next morning, there was no early wake-up call from Mr. Norris. Instead, I was awakened by Sophie. She had crept across the hallway as soon as her father had left the house to begin his workday, having decided to sneak in some cuddle time before the rest of the family got up. "Dad says he doesn't need you today," she whispered, climbing into bed and wrapping one of my arms around her. "So it's just me and you today, baby. A whole Sunday together, like back in Boston." It was bliss, absolute bliss, and for the first time that whole weekend, things just felt right again. Later that morning, as we were sat around the kitchen table, Miss Norris spoke up. "Sophie, your brother and I have to head into town today to pick up a few odds and ends. Can you and Alex here be trusted to be alone around the house?" "Is Dad not going with you?" "He isn't, but he's got business to attend to around the farm, some repairs and what have you. He might not be back until later this afternoon." "Oh, okay. I mean, sure. Me and Alex will keep this place spick and span for you guys. Don't worry." "Good. Now you two just make sure you enjoy your last day of Alex's visit." "Thank you, Miss Norris. I really appreciate the sentiment," I said. Sophie's mom was a very sweet lady, but I couldn't help wonder how she ended up with her husband. Not only that, but I wondered just what they'd both been talking about the night before. After Mr. Norris and her son had left, Sophie and I rushed up to her bedroom to do exactly what young lovers get up to when left alone for a few hours. It was made all the more exciting for me by the fact that Mr. Norris could arrive back pretty much at any moment, and I knew Sophie felt the same way. So despite the fact that it was rushed and hushed, I feel like we made up for all the lost time the summer break had burdened us with. When it was done, Sophie got up to take a bath, which left me with a little time to explore the house. It was your typical family home in many respects, full of knickknacks, ornaments, drawings, and paintings that Sophie and her brother had done when they were children. Not to mention a plethora of family photos hung all around the walls, one of which included a delighted Sophie holding up her acceptance letter to Boston University. But my curiosity definitely got the better of me at one point, and I found myself rooting through bookshelves and cupboards just to see what I could find. In an old cupboard, I found a stack of old photographs, black and white ones that had been taken in 40s or 50s. One in particular showed a man about the same age as Sophie's father, who I suspected to be her parental grandfather. At least, it had to be, as the man looked almost identical to her dad. He had the same style of denim dungarees on, the same wary expression on his particularly indistinguishable face. Another showed the whole family unit, mom, dad, brother, and sister, all lined up in front of the same brick red barn that stood nearby the house. Each family member bore a disturbingly similar likeness to the people I was staying with that weekend. In fact, if you told me that this was just a picture of them taken with an old-style camera, I'd have believed you, no questions asked. But I didn't focus on the likeness for too long, as something in the background of the photograph caught my eye. It was a blurry, dark shape that looked to be peering around the edge of the barn. But given the poor quality of the photograph, there was no way of me to distinguish exactly what it was. Suitably weirded out, I put the photos away and continued my exploration of the house. I found myself exploring the kitchen area, admiring some of the older, more antique food preparation devices that were obviously still in use. I thought about how much my mom would freak if she saw some of this stuff. She loved anything rustic like that, and always used to tell me how it reminded her of her childhood in rural Massachusetts. I made my way into the family larder, admiring some of the hand-labeled cans of vegetables that were obviously contained products from the farm itself. Sure, I found their way of living to be a little strange, but there was still something deeply charming about it, even if it was adversely alien to what I was accustomed to back home. But at the back of one of the cupboards there, I found something that made my jaw drop. It was a large burlap sack full of coins. I'm not talking small denominations. These were huge and appeared to be solid silver. Not silver dollars either. I mean, that would have been strange, but at least explainable. These things looked like they were huge chunks of silver. A little side note here. An uncle of mine owned a pawn shop in Charlestown for most of his life, and he would often bore us to tears with stories of people who tried to rip him off with frauds or fakes. But I remember the details of one particular story, where he told me and my cousins that you could always tell if something was genuine silver by the markings on it. Silver dealers would often stamp silver with a particular numbers which indicated the percentage of fine silver in the piece. A stamp of 900 or 800 means the piece is 90% or 80% silver, and is often called coin silver, or in other words, not totally pure. But the hunks of metal in the burlap sack had no markings on them whatsoever, which I found very suspicious. My uncle also bored us with a foolproof technique of testing whether or not silver was genuine, what he called the ice test. He told us that silver happened to be particularly good at conductor of heat, so if you place a piece of ice on it, the ice starts to melt pretty much immediately, almost like it's been placed on something warm, rather than just any regular old metal. I made sure the coast was clear and took the coin to the family freezer, and popped a piece of ice out of the ice tray before placing it on the coin. And no way, the ice started to melt right away. I was dumbstruck. I was holding what appeared to be a piece of pure silver in my hand. No wonder the family could afford to pay Sophie's college fees. They had a huge stack of pure silver, just sitting there in their goddamn larder. And that couldn't have been all of it. At least, that's what I told myself. There had to be more. Much more. Somewhere secure so it would be safe from potential thieves or home invaders. But just where exactly were they getting this stuff from? I had no idea. Mr. Norris had mentioned something to do with investments, sure, but who the hell pays out of silver? And pure silver at that. Silver that was unregulated by international markets. That, coupled with the photos, the strange vegetables, and photographs, just who was this family? It was then that I heard footsteps coming from the upper floor. Sophie was out of the bath and was bound to head downstairs at any moment. I scurried back into the larder, placed the wet piece of silver back into the burlap sack, and rushed back out and got myself a glass of water, to play all innocent as I heard her coming down the stairs. "Alex, what are you doing here?" she asked, clearly suspicious. "Oh, me?" I replied. Nothing at all. Just getting myself a drink is all." I'm a terrible liar. Always have been. And she could read it on my face that something was wrong. "Is there something you want to talk to me about?" she asked in an accusatory tone. "Nah, nothing. I mean, what would there be to talk about?" I know you haven't been enjoying my mom's cooking." "Hey, it's fine. I mean, I had no idea I was such a fussy eater, but turns out you keep living and learning, huh?" "Alex, there are things you should know about this family." "Like what?" We're not like other folks, not even folks around here. And there may have been some things you might have seen around the farm this weekend. Things that seemed a little off." "What are you trying to say, Sophie?" I asked, but it was a sick charade at this point. The look I was giving her told her all she needed to know. "Things like, well, I don't quite know how to tell you this, but..."
"Sophie, Alex, you two here?"
It was Mr. Norris, with the most imaginable timing. Sophie's expression turned from one of discomfort to one of perkiness. "In here, Dad. Me and Alex were just about to make ourselves a snack."
"No time for that just yet. I need Alex to come help me with something. It won't take long, but it's important."
Sure, Mr. Norris. I'll be right out." I followed Mr. Norris outside, tracing his footsteps into the cornfield, where 2 full wheelbarrows full of snow-white corn torn from their fleshy husks.
"Give me a hand with these, would you?"
I obliged, pushing one of these 2 barrows back towards the house. But as we did so, we passed by the large brick-red barn that stood near the farmhouse. As we approached, I set eyes on the thick wooden paneling. I began to feel distinctly uneasy. At first I assumed it was because it reminded me of those old family photos, and how the figures in them looked eerily similar to the current occupants of the house. But then I began to hear something coming from inside. I stopped pushing the barrow for a moment, and strained my ears to hear what the noise was, and began to hear a faint kind of snuffling sound coming from behind the boards. Mr. Norris had told me that the only livestock on the farm were the cows they kept in the cattle shed. So just what was living in there? It was then that I heard it, a muffled but unmistakable sound of squealing. As I stood there, an obviously confused look on my face, Mr. Norris also stopped wheeling his barrow, turning to look at me with a grave look in his eyes.
"What's wrong, boy?"
"What's in the barn, Mr. Norris?"
"Nothing, just some camping equipment,"
he replied irritably. I just stared back at him, feeling the anger of being lied to rising in my gut. Mr. Norris dropped his barrow hard into the dark, turning on a dime before me and marched over to me.
"Are you and me going to have a problem, son?"
he seethed. "No, sir," I replied, more defiant than polite.
Let me tell you something right now, boy, he growled through gritted teeth. You don't ever go near this barn, ever. Is that clear?
Crystal clear, I replied, feeling the adrenaline coursing through me.
If I catch you sniffing around here at all, you will never set foot on this farm again, and I will make damn sure you and Sophie won't be seeing each other anymore. Now pick that wheelbarrow up and bring it to the house.
That night's dinner was beyond awkward. Mr. Norris was obviously in a bad mood after our confrontation, and it seemed like the rest of the family were accustomed to treading on eggshells whenever he was tense. The feeling was compounded for me by the fact that not only was I intensely craving nicotine, but thanks to the bizarre, unpalatable flavors of Miss Noren's cooking, I hadn't eaten properly in almost 48 hours. I was starving, but I wasn't about to eat anything that was going to make me sick again. So I found myself just sort of moving the food around my plate, nibbling at bitter-tasting roast potatoes that seemed far too wet and fleshy on the insides. We ate in absolute silence, so that when Sophie's brother dropped his cutlery onto his dinner plate with a loud clatter, the entire table almost jumped out of their seats with fright. I looked up at him, watching as he began to shudder and grunt, his eyes rolling back into their sockets. "What is it, son?" Miss Norris asked, a palpable fear in her voice. And for the first time that entire weekend, Sophie's brother spoke.
Hungry.
His voice bubbled with phlegm, rasping up from barely used vocal cords.
So hungry.
As he sat before a plate of meat and vegetables that was almost completely consumed, I got the distinct impression that he wasn't talking about himself. Mr. Norris rose from the table, his chair legs grinding against the floor. As he did so, his son mirrored his movements perfectly, following him out of the room and out of sight, before I heard the front door to the house open and close with a slam. Is he okay?" I asked, pointing after Sophie's brother. "Sure he is. He gets like that from time to time. Ammo's probably taking him outside to feed the cows," Miss Norris replied, not looking up from her food as she finished off her last few morsels. As strange as the weekend had been at this point, the last thing I was going to do was start asking and probing accusatory questions regarding the guy's obvious disabilities. So I just continued to eat what little I could stomach from my plate in silence before Sophie got up to clear my plate. "Wanna come sit with me on the porch?" she asked with a smile. I had been meaning to get some more alone time with her, but not for the reasons you might think, and I agreed, cleared my own plate, and followed her out to watch the sunset. We sat down on a long swing seat for a few quiet minutes, holding hands and enjoying the tranquility of the evening. But I was anything but relaxed, and it took quite a while before I found the courage to speak up. By the time I did, the sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, and darkness was setting in fast. "Sophie, I think we need to talk." "Sure, what's up?" "Well, you know I'm headed back to Boston in the morning, right?" "Yeah, and I'm gonna miss you." She gave my hand a gentle squeeze as she spoke. "I'll miss you too, but I think you should come with me." "Wait, why?" she asked, turning towards me in confusion. "I know this is your home. I know these people are your family, and that you love them," I began. "But there's something wrong with this place, Sophie, and I think you know that as well as I do." "There's nothing wrong with this place, Alex. Things are the way they've always been. I told you we were different." "Okay, so there's different, and then there's just wrong." I lowered my voice, fearful that one of our family would overhear. "Have you seen the cows lately? The stuff growing in those fields? This place is bad, Sophie. There's something very wrong going on here." You know, when I invited you out here, I thought there was a chance you'd understand. I thought you might have been open-minded enough to see that we have something special here. And we really do. For a long, long time now, we've been nothing but blessed. Only now do I really know what she meant by that. But at the time, I was simply too blinded by my feelings for her to really put two and two together. I get that you can't see it. I do. This is what you know, but I'm begging you, please come back to Boston in the morning. It's not safe here, Sophie. No, you don't get it, Alex. I'm safer here than I am anywhere out there. We could have given you something more precious than anything, but you're just too ignorant to understand that. I get that now. So go ahead, go back home in the morning, but don't bother calling me again. We're done. Wait, what? Are you can't be serious, I hissed. You're breaking up with me over this? This, she growled back at me, is my home, and obviously you have a huge problem with that. So just leave. Why bother waiting until morning if this place is so terrible? Go pack your stuff and get out of here. Sophie, please, I love you. I tried to continue, but she raised a hand to cut me off. She rose from the swing seat, and as she did, I detected a coldness to her person that I'd never felt before in all the time we were together. Just leave, she barked. You know, now that I think about it, I don't think I ever felt anything for you anymore. In fact, I'm not even sure I ever did. How can you even say that? I heard my own voice begin to crack under the pressure. This isn't you, Sophie. Sophie, the same girl that had brought me a single pink rose wrapped up in brown paper and string from our art supplies. She was a hopeless romantic, but it was like that same girl was shriveling up and ebbing away before my very eyes. You were a mistake, Alex. This whole thing was a giant mistake. I struggled to find any words, feeling my lips tremble as I felt my heart tear into two inside my chest. Her reaction was one I would never have expected. Not in a million years. Not from this girl. She laughed. Oh, what? Don't tell me you were gonna cry, she said with a cruel giggle. Don't embarrass yourself any more than you already have. What the freak, Sophie? I thought you liked dark humor. The question was so out of left field that my head swarmed with confusion. I had no idea she could be like that, and as I once again struggled to find the words to express how hurt I feel, she walked off the porch and back into the house. I took a few moments to compose myself, fighting back tears as I felt my entire world crashing down around me. Cigarette cravings had me feeling like my chest might explode. Every fiber of my being craved the drug I tried to cut for myself, my sole motivation being to impress Sophie's father, to impress Sophie herself. I broke. Walking back inside, I walked straight past the kitchen, past the cold stare of Miss Norris and her husband, who had apparently returned during mine and Sophie's argument, and up to the guest room. I rummaged through my things, fishing out the pack of cigarettes I'd stuffed down into the bottom of my bag, and walked back onto the landing. I was practically shivering with anticipation, my nicotine-starved brain reacting with childish excitement at the prospect of my first cigarette in what seemed like forever. But before I did, I had to check in on Sophie. I couldn't risk being thrown off the farm by her father without at least apologizing, or saying goodbye at first. My footsteps were soft as I approached her bedroom, somewhere I'd never been before. It always felt like some kind of a transgression to knock on the door before gently pushing upon. I'd wonder what it was like in there, how it was probably some haven of beautiful paintings and carefully sketched drawings, but I never expected to see what I did when I looked inside. She was painting, all right, but she was painting something in black paint that was identical image to what was plastered all over the walls of her bedroom. At first I thought it was some kind of symbol, until I began to recognize an almost humanoid shape at the center of each piece. Each image seemed more horrifying than the last, and I found myself just standing there, mouth agape, as I surveyed the vision of insanity. Sophie kept on painting for a moment before she heard the door creak on its hinges, slapping jet black paint onto the sheets of white paper before scratching it into that horrific, dark shape. The look of fury in her eyes when she turned to see me made me look almost as monstrous as the thing she had painted. "Get out," she growled, trembling with rage as her knuckles turned white around the paintbrush. I just edged out of the room, closing it quietly behind me before I walked downstairs and out into the front yard. By that point, I wasn't just shaking from being racked from the cravings of addiction. It was pure, terrible confusion that had me trembling and sweating. The idea of Sophie, of this loving, pure-hearted young woman, had been a complete fantasy, a stark difference to the horrible reality. I put a cigarette between my lips, rummaging into the pocket of my jeans for a lighter before bringing the flame to the sweet-smelling tobacco. The release was intense, my head spinning with the nicotine hit as I breathed in a lungful of thick, tar-laden smoke. As the intense waves of relaxation washed over me, I began to think about the whole thing might have been just in my head, that I was just stressed to the point of being overly anxious and critical. A city kid who was just out of his depth in a world full of the hardiest of people. But in that moment, I found myself wandering back towards the barn, looking over my shoulder to make sure Mr. Norris wasn't watching from the window. In the quiet of the twilight, I heard the same horrible noise again, coming from the interior of the barn. A muffled snuffling and squealing that made my skin crawl. I had to know what was in there. If my future lay anywhere near this farm, I had to know. I began to walk around the barn, looking for anything unusual, anything that might clue me into what was being held in there. Around one side, out of sight of the farmhouse, I noticed that the section of smashed boards had recently been replaced. It was a shoddy job, and I quickly stamped out my lit cigarette on the ground, taking out a small knife I kept on a keychain before I began to pry away the boards. With each one I loosened, the sounds from inside became louder and louder, and it was obvious what I was hearing. There were pigs in there, but the noises they were making was nothing like I'd never heard before. Once I'd cleared a large enough hole, I got down on my hands and knees and began to crawl through the gap, into the dark interior of the farm. I slapped at my hands and arms, feeling things crawling all over them before I managed to find my feet. I could feel the cobwebs clinging to my hair before I dusted them off, fishing in my pocket again for the phone so I could bring up the flashlight app. As I turned it on and the bright, white light shone into the interior of the barn, what I saw first was so inexplicable, alien to me, at first I had trouble processing what it was. There was a large table set out in front of me, and on it lay a broken, butchered animal cadaver. Only there was something horrifyingly familiar about the shape of the thing. How its legs seemed to be a little too long, how its face seemed to be a little too fat. Then it hit me. It was the same thing I'd seen in the cornfield that day, the same thing that had been looking back at me with squinty, obsidian black eyes. But it couldn't have been. This thing was much larger, at least 5 feet from the stem to the stern, while the thing in the cornfield couldn't have been any taller than a few feet at best. I approached the table slowly, shedding the phone's light over the thing as fat, black flies buzzed idly as they feasted on the remains. Whatever it was had been surrounded by melted, burned-out candles, with strange, black carvings cut into the wood surrounding its form. The cadaver had clearly defined porcine features, a snout, trotters, and thick black hair all over its body. But its genitals, its lack of hair, and its grotesquely fingered hands were clearly more human than anything else. But my mouth dropped open when I saw what was at its center. Its belly had been torn open, the flesh bearing the rough marks of being ripped, not cut, as if with some sharpened, bladed implement. And inside, something gore-soaked glimmered under the bright light of my phone. Silver coins. Its insides were stuffed with silver coins that seemed to overflow from its burst entrails. But I barely had time to reflect on what we were seeing before a squeal from one corner of the barn demanded my attention. I turned, shining my phone's light in that direction, recoiling in horror at what I saw. In a large, elongated stall, several of the same piggish creatures kneeled in a bed of dry hay. They were lined up side by side, jostling for position as they suckled and snuffed at the belly of something considerably and grotesquely larger. It was their mother, a huge, bulbous, pig-like creature with flesh as black as coal dust laid on its side in the hay. But again, it was like no animal I'd ever seen before. Its legs were more like that of a spider, sectioned and bony thin, which kicked lazily every so often as its young suckled away. But its eyes, my God, its eyes. They were many, far, far too many. Larger and smaller beads of obsidian flesh that grew from its malted black ears and extended down its snout. However, it must have been blind, as it didn't react at all as I shone the torch all over its body. Its young didn't react either. Through ignorance or obliviousness to their frenzy feeding, I wasn't sure. But it occurred to me that they may not have been reacting to me because they were already used to the presence of people. These were things that should not be, things that had no right to exist by any natural law. And with that thought in my mind, I just reacted. I took the lighter from my pocket and began to spark it, touching the naked flame to as much of the dry, spindled hay as I could manage. Sparks could be heard all around me by the time the interior of the barn became illuminated by the bright orange glow, smoke billowing up into the rafters as I ran back into the hole I paneled and crawled across into the night. I could hear the muffled squealing grow into painful screeching as I ran towards my car, not daring to collect any of the items I left in the guest bedroom. The sounds coming from the barn were the stuff of nightmares as I climbed into the driver's side, hearing the chorus of wounded shrieks joined by the hammering on the inside of the barn door. The things were trying to break out, trying to escape the flames, yet being roasted in the process. At first, as I slid the key into the ignition, the engine refused to start, and as the figures of the family began to appear on the porch, it occurred to me in one horrible moment of realization that they may have sabotaged my car. I twisted the key over and over again, watching as Sophie's father and brother ran at the barn with pails of water, throwing them uselessly onto the flames before watching the entire structure was engulfed into a fiery conflagration. Finally, as my engine started up, they turned and began to give chase. I expected them to catch me at any moment, but I watched in my rearview mirror as it began to slow, seeming like they were weakening with each passing second. I remember Sophie's father in particular, falling into the dirt as his knees seemed to give out completely, a streak of white hair where his natural brown should have been. He was changing. Each of them were. Wilting like unwatered flowers before collapsing to the ground. They were aging and dying before my very eyes. And the last time I ever laid eyes on my beloved Sophie, as she crawled along the earth in pursuit of me, she looked 100 years old. I drove all night, foot on the gas until a sliver of blue appeared on the eastern horizon, and my fuel gauge ticked dangerously low. And after I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Detroit, I got out of my car and almost collapsed against the hood after bursting into tears. Only one other traveler was present, an older man, who just pretended he didn't see me before heading into the gas station store to pay up. I kept seeing Sophie's face in my mind, the way she used to smile at me when we first met. I couldn't reconcile how she looked in the end, withered, ancient, angry. The entirety of the past few days seemed like a blur, like the whole thing had been one long bad dream. I was exhausted, weak from near starvation, but my appetite was evidently in no rush to return. Somehow, I managed to pull myself together, stepping off of the forecourt and smoking another cigarette away from the gas pumps to curb my nerves. Then I walked back over to my car, pumped a fresh tank of gas into her, and then followed the path of the older driver into the gas station to pay my bill. I just felt numb. Maybe I shouldn't have been relieved that the nightmare was over, that I had somehow escaped the sort of hellish place within my life. But it was little consolation. I'd lost the love of my life, even though it did turn out that she was never really who I thought she was. The clerk behind the counter was some punk chick. Tired green eyes looked up at me from underneath a shock of purple hair as she nursed the black coffee. Therese, her name badge said. I had to clear my throat to make myself heard as I slid a 20 across the countertop. I'm number 4. She got off her stool and began to tender my money when I saw she had a small TV box with her, one that showed an oddly familiar landscape. Hey, I said. Turn that up for a second. The clerk shot me a displeased look, but obliged me all the same. The TV showed a newscast, images from a helicopter that circled something that was surrounding an endless cornfield. What is without a doubt a geological phenomenon of almost unprecedented scale here in the United States, the voice from the speaker cackled. As you can see, Mark, the newly formed sinkhole is hundreds of feet wide. We're talking whole football fields here, and no one is quite sure how deep it goes. Crazy, huh? The clerk said. Happened just a few hours ago. Hope no one got hurt. No, I replied dully. No one did. Oh yeah? And how would you know? But I was already walking out of the door, getting ready for the long remainder of the drive back home, where I had no doubt I would spend the rest of my life trying to forget the things I saw, and the things I heard, back on that terrible place that pretended to be a farm. End of story. Thank you for watching my channel, She's Just Trying. That was the last part of the farm series. If you like what you saw and like what you heard, make sure to hit the like and the subscribe button. I'll be reading more stories like this, but make sure to check out the author because this story was really fun to read. Anyways, my Patreon and my Ko-fi is in the description, so if you'd like to support me in any way while I'm not monetized, I would really appreciate it. I'm also on Twitter, and I'll reply to any tweets you at me in. So anyways, stay safe, and bye!